They had thrown a festival. Across 9 galactic sectors, the banners of the Conclave of Sovereignties unfurled like curtains over a finished killing. And every holoscreen, from the Vyrix ring stations to the Kethri orbital gardens, was tuned to the same broadcast. The formal declaration that the species the aliens had learned to call humans had, at last, been broken. On the station of Tessin III, in the gilded chamber above the veiled sea, Empress Envoy Serene Vol of the Vyrix Imperium raised a crystal cup. The other envoys rose with her. Across the chamber, the drones captured every polished smile, every inclined head, every carefully rehearsed moment of galactic relief. The war, the announcer said, was over. The human fleet had been shattered at Halcyon Prime. The Accord of Halcyon had been signed by the surviving Terran envoys. 3 million human civilians had been placed under Vyrix stewardship. The rest of Earth would follow by winter, and would be welcomed with great patience into the protective embrace of the greater galactic community. It was a beautiful lie. It was the lie the galaxy wanted to believe. 7 years earlier, Earth had been a name spoken in galactic politics the way a child speaks of a distant storm. Small, distant, loud once, perhaps, but settled now. The Conclave had welcomed human admission to the interstellar community the way a hostess welcomes a stray at the garden gate. Graciously, with a long, patient smile, and with one hand already resting near the door. Humanity had signed the Charter of Open Skies. Humanity had signed the Accord of Halcyon. Humanity had accepted the inspection regime of the Conclave with a quietness that the diplomats mistook for gratitude, and with a grace that the Vyrix mistook for surrender. Humanity had done everything the civilized galaxy had asked of it, and in return had been addressed, every time, in the formal register reserved for species still learning how to sit at the table. The mistake began, as these mistakes always begin, with one particular insult. Vice Admiral Yara Chen remembered it because she had been there. She had stood, in uniform, in a chamber smaller than the one on Tessin III, but no less cold, while a Vyrix trade envoy named Colin Draith explained in slow, condescending syllables that the human species was welcome to participate in the commerce of the Conclave. To participate. Not to shape it. Not to lead it. To participate. Behind her, in the gallery reserved for observers, 2 junior Kethri diplomats had laughed. Quietly. Politely. The way one laughs at a child performing at a recital. That was the first day Chen logged the insult. She did not raise her voice. She did not protest. She returned to the carrier pact of Ashford, transmitted a single line of compressed code to an address that no living officer was supposed to know still existed, and went to her quarters. She did not sleep that night. She did not need to. The work she had been hired to do had finally begun. That address belonged to a chain of command so old, so deeply buried beneath the tidy surface of human diplomacy that even most human admirals did not know of its existence. It ran from the Civilian Defense Council in Geneva, through a series of dead drops scattered across 7 star systems, into the sealed vaults of a single research complex buried under the Alaskan tundra. From those vaults, in years past, the doctrine of severance had been born. A doctrine so unthinkable, so utterly immoral by the standards of every other civilization on the Conclave's rolls, that it had been locked away in a drawer alongside the contingencies for extinction-level war. The doctrine of severance held a single brutal premise, that if humanity was ever destroyed as a sovereign species, the destruction would not be permitted to be quiet. If Earth fell, the galaxy was to learn what Earth had truly been. 3 years before the festival on Tessin III, the Vyrix Imperium had given humanity the first true provocation. A Vyrix patrol carrier had opened fire without warning on the human transport Bright Compass above the neutral world of Kalin 4. 14 crew had died. The Conclave had convened an emergency session. The Vyrix envoy had apologized. The apology had been received, transmitted back to Earth, and formally accepted on the public record of the Conclave within 72 standard hours. The Kethri delegation had issued a note of concern. The Axir delegation had issued a note of sympathy. Both notes had been entered into the Chamber's archive and promptly forgotten, the way the galaxy had forgotten 1,000 smaller insults delivered over decades against the same patient species. Earth had smiled through its teeth. Chen had transmitted a second line of code to the address no one was supposed to know. Somewhere in the dark between stars, a cascade of dormant systems stirred just enough to be aware of the wind. They had begun to plan for war. The actual war, when it came, was not what anyone expected. It arrived not as a fleet engagement or a blockade or an ultimatum, but as a treaty violation so quiet that many human civilians never heard the gunfire. The Vyrix Imperium, citing a fabricated dispute over mining rights on a world the Conclave's own registry had certified as Terran, dispatched a carrier group to Halcyon Prime, a human colony of 3 million souls, and declared it placed under protective stewardship. When the human garrison refused to stand down, the carrier group opened fire. Within 9 minutes, the orbital defense grid was gone. Within 40, the atmospheric shields were gone. Within a single hour, the civilian government had been removed at gunpoint, and the colony's populace had been herded into processing centers under Vyrix command, where the names of the dead would not be released, and the names of the living would be entered into a different kind of ledger. The Conclave received the report on Halcyon Prime the way it received everything, with measured concern, careful neutrality, and the particular kind of silence that passes for wisdom in galactic politics. No resolution was passed, no sanction was proposed. A single junior Kethri delegate raised the matter on the floor and was politely informed that the matter was under review. The matter remained under review for 19 days. By the 19th day, the human population of Halcyon Prime had been reduced, by a number the Vyrix did not publicly share, to a number the humans would never publicly forgive. They had learned by then that the Conclave's neutrality was not neutrality. It was permission. Chen's response was not a protest. It was not a diplomatic note. It was not even an attack. It was, in the careful language of Earth, a declination. The Conclave's servers received a single signed transmission at 0400 station time on Tessin 3. It was logged, indexed, and routed to the appropriate subcommittees with the usual frictionless indifference. The transmission read, in full, "The Terran sovereignty declines to recognize the legitimacy of any decision of the Conclave rendered under the present composition of the Chamber. All treaties of accession are hereby placed under formal review. Terran diplomatic personnel are being withdrawn to home territory for consultations. No further communications will be accepted on the prior channels. The Terran sovereignty will provide additional notification through appropriate channels at a time and in a manner of its own choosing." Then Earth went silent. Not the polite silence of negotiation, not the burdened silence of mourning. The kind of silence that a predator makes when it has stopped circling and has begun, finally, to move through the snow. On Tessin 3, the envoys had celebrated early. They had not understood that the silence of Earth was not the silence of a broken species. It was the silence of a species that had stopped pretending to be small. The doctrine of severance, ratified by 7 successive Terran administrations and never once invoked outside of a war game, had at last been authorized by the Civilian Defense Council in Geneva. And the address in the Alaskan vault, which had stood dormant for almost 80 years, had finally been opened. The doctrine had a name for what it had prepared. It was called Project Cinder. In the 7 decades before the war, when humanity had seemed to the rest of the galaxy to be a species content with its small fleet and its tidy treaties, the engineers of Project Cinder had done something the diplomats of every other civilization would have called insane. They had built, in deep, stable orbits far beyond the charted lanes of conclave traffic, in regions of space that no scout had bothered to map because no resource was thought worth mining, 10,000 military hulls. Dreadnoughts, carriers, cruisers, escorts, logistics tenders, sensor pickets, drone tenders, hospital ships mute with empty beds. Every hull was rated combat ready. Every crew rotation had been planned 2 generations ahead. Every maintenance schedule had been, in the most literal sense of the word, eternal. The crews had been trained, retrained, and trained again in simulators built from the same doctrinal texts the envoys on Tessin III had never been permitted to read. The ships had simply not been lit. They had drifted in the dark, like seeds in winter, waiting for the thermometer to fall. On the 19th day after Halcyon Prime, when the chamber on Tessin III was still clinking glasses against the backdrop of a beautiful false broadcast, the thermometer fell. The hyperspace telemetry stations of 7 different species lit up at once. Every long-range sensor in the sector went blind for an instant. Not because the sky had broken, but because the sky had been, suddenly and without warning, full. Out of the dark lanes beyond the charted map, beyond the patrol arcs of the Vyrix frontier, 10,000 human warships dropped into real space on a bearing that converged with the precise geometry of a held breath on the Vyrix Frontier Command at Scion 7. It was the most terrifying formation in the recorded history of the Conclave, because it was the most disciplined. The fleet did not transmit a single identification beacon that matched the public registry of the Terran fleet. It did not hail the Conclave. It did not hail the Vyrix. It came forward in absolute radio silence, running on the protocol embedded by the doctrine 70 years prior. And it carried, in its sealed diplomatic compartment at the head of every line, a single envoy ship crewed, in the tradition of human protocol, by a single unarmed diplomatic officer and a single armed Marine in dress uniform. The single envoy who stepped forward onto the holochannel of the Conclave was Vice Admiral Yara Chen, in dress uniform, with 1 star pinned to each epaulet, and the rank insignia of the Terran sovereignty on her shoulder. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "The Terran sovereignty," she said, "has reviewed the recent decisions of this chamber. The Terran sovereignty has concluded that the principle of mutual respect on which these proceedings were founded has been exhausted. The Terran sovereignty does not request a hearing. The Terran sovereignty does not request an apology. The Terran sovereignty has come to deliver a correction." The Conclave's servers logged the transmission the way they had logged her declination, with the same patient, automated indifference. The Conclave's favored analysts, those whose smiling faces had graced the festival broadcast, were still smiling. Several of them were mid-sip of their celebratory drinks when the Vyrix Frontier Command at Scion 7 went dark. Not under attack, the fleet did not open fire. Scion 7 went dark because its crew, watching the formation emerge on long-range sensors, had stopped responding to commands. Chen's correction, as she had taken care to label it, was surgical. The formation did not destroy the Vyrix Frontier Command. It surrounded it. 1 dreadnought at 4,000 kilometers, 1 carrier at 8, 3 cruisers at 12. The rest of the line moving in a slow, deliberate orbit, a formation so tight and so quiet that the Vyrix commander aboard the command station an experienced officer named Rethan Vok, felt, in the words of his own later testimony, as though I were standing inside a mouth that had not yet decided whether to close. The conclave, for its part, did not move. Empress Envoy Vol on Tessin III called for an emergency session. The session was convened. The Vyrix delegation demanded an immediate halt to Terran military activity in the sector. The Kethri delegation seconded the demand. The Axiar delegation, which had always been the closest the conclave had to a moral voice, issued a mild statement of concern. The statement was recorded, indexed, and routed to a subcommittee that would not meet again in the speaker's lifetime. It was at that moment, watching her colleagues pretend surprise, that the Axiar delegate spoke the words that would later be carved into the walls of the conclave memorial on Liern 4. "You did not think," she said to Vol very quietly, "that they were actually small." The fleet at Scion 7 did not fire. It did not need to. Within 72 hours, the formation had expanded across 12 Vyrix systems, each one ringed with the same precise surgical geometry. Within a week, 38 Vyrix logistic hubs had been neutralized without a single civilian casualty. The fleet took no prisoners. It did not need to. The crews of the disabled stations, watching the quiet human dreadnoughts swing into holding orbit with their running lights on and weapons cold, surrendered themselves with the strange calm of people who understood, finally and completely, that the species they had broken at Halcyon Prime had not, in any meaningful sense, ever been broken. Earth had simply not been in the room. The conclave's celebration had been a celebration of an empty chair. When the formal terms of the new accord were transmitted on the 34th day, the chamber on Tessin III did not vote to reject them. It did not vote at all. It received the terms, the unconditional return of Halcyon Prime, the restoration of full Terran sovereignty over every disputed system, the dismantling of every processing center the Vyrix had built, the release of every name the Vyrix had not publicly shared, and the recognition, on the public record of the conclave, that the species known as humanity was to be addressed henceforth in the formal register reserved for first-rank galactic civilizations. And the terms were accepted, in silence, by every delegation that had been present at the festival. There was no applause. There was no objection. There was only the long, slow sound of a chamber learning, in real time, the shape of what it had been measuring itself against. Empress Envoy Vol, in her formal response, did not apologize. The protocol of the Vyrix does not permit it. She did, however, transmit a single line of text to her counterpart on Earth. Not the old public channel, but a new, restricted address that the Vyrix had quietly established the day after Scion 7 was corralled. It read, in full, "The Vyrix Imperium acknowledges the sovereign standing of the Terran species and requests the opening of renewed consultations on the matters previously deferred." Chen received the transmission in the flag bridge of the Dreadnought Pact of Ashford, with one star pinned to each epaulet and the rank insignia of the Terran sovereignty on her shoulder. She read the line once. She set down her cup. She did not smile. She transmitted a single line back, in the same compressed code she had sent 7 years earlier to the address no one was supposed to know still existed. The line read, "Noted. The consultations will be held on Earth." The galaxy, in the weeks that followed, would learn to use the word human the way it learned to use the word star. Not as a curiosity, not as a decoration, not as a punchline for a festival toast, but as a coordinate, a reference, a thing against which the rest of the chart was drawn. The Vyrix rerouted their patrol arcs. The Kethri, who had laughed at the recital 7 years earlier, did not laugh again. The Axiar, in a quiet public address that would be replayed for generations, would say only that the conclave had been informed, many times of what humanity was, and had chosen, each time, to look away. On Earth, the festivals would resume. They would be smaller, quieter, and would not be televised beyond the orbit of Mars. The children who grew up in their shadow would not be taught that humanity had been saved by a hidden fleet, because the doctrine did not permit it. They would be taught, instead, that humanity had been saved by patience, by discipline, and by the willingness of a few quiet people to do a long, unglamorous work that no one would ever congratulate them for. Chen's statue in a small park in Geneva would not be raised for another 11 years. And in the dark, beyond the charted lanes, the dreadnoughts of Project Cinder would begin, one by one, the long, slow process of going to sleep again. The galaxy would never throw another festival in Earth's name. The next time the conclave spoke of humanity, it would speak carefully, in a low register, the way one speaks of a thing that does not sleep and does not forgive, and is patient beyond any measure the diplomats of the Gilded Chambers had ever cared to learn.